On October 6, 1973, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, Israel seemed wrapped in silence. Across the country, families sat in synagogues, fasting and praying. Radios were quiet, streets were empty, soldiers were home on leave. It was Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. At precisely 2 in the afternoon, that silence shattered. Sirens wailed, and across Israel's borders, artillery thundered. Egyptian forces surged across the Suez Canal, and Syrian tanks rolled down the Golan Heights. The surprise was complete. Israel was at war again, this time fighting for its survival in what would become one of the most ferocious conflicts of the Cold War. The roots of the war lay 6 years earlier, in the lightning triumph of the Six-Day War of 1967. Israel had seized the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the Golan Heights from Syria, and the West Bank from Jordan. For Israel, it was a stunning victory. For the Arab states, it was humiliation. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Syrian President Hafez al-Assad vowed to reclaim the lost lands, restore pride, and reverse the humiliation. Diplomacy failed, ceasefires led nowhere, and the memory of defeat festered. By 1973, Sadat and Assad decided to strike. The plan was bold. The Egyptians would cross the Suez Canal and storm into the Sinai. The Syrians would sweep down from the Golan Heights into northern Israel. Together, they hoped to overwhelm Israel before it could mobilize its reserves. To maximize surprise, they chose Yom Kippur, when much of the country shut down and even radio traffic dropped. At the same time, both Egypt and Syria had rebuilt their militaries with Soviet weapons, T-55 and T-62 tanks, SA-6 surface-to-air missiles, MiG fighter jets. The scale of the assault stunned even seasoned observers. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, 2,000 Egyptian guns opened fire along the Suez Canal. The barrage shook the desert, pulverizing Israeli bunkers along the Bar-Lev line. Minutes later, Egyptian engineers rushed the water's edge with high-powered hoses, blasting holes in the sand berms. Within hours, bridges and pontoons spanned the canal, and waves of Egyptian soldiers crossed into the Sinai. They carried RPGs and Sagar anti-tank missiles, weapons designed to neutralize Israel's armored counterattacks. By nightfall, tens of thousands were across, and the Israeli defenses were reeling. Meanwhile, in the north, 1,400 Syrian tanks rolled onto the Golan Heights, facing fewer than 200 Israeli tanks. The defenders, vastly outnumbered, held on desperately. Small crews of Israeli Centurion tanks fought until their barrels glowed red, halting wave after wave. But the Syrians kept coming. Villages in northern Israel were evacuated as civilians feared the front might collapse. For a moment, the fate of the country seemed to hang by a thread. In those first days, the situation looked catastrophic. Israeli forces were caught off guard, suffering heavy casualties. Hundreds of tanks were destroyed, and Air Force squadrons were shot from the skies by dense, Soviet-made missile defenses. The aura of invincibility that Israel had carried since 1967 shattered in the desert sands. Families crowded around radios, listening in shock as casualty lists grew. Soldiers rushed from synagogues straight to the front lines. The nation mobilized, but its confidence was shaken. By October 9th, however, the tide began to shift. On the Golan, Israeli tank crews managed to hold the line at places like the Valley of Tears, where fewer than 100 Israeli tanks held back over 500 Syrian machines. Exhausted, low on ammunition, and often fighting alone, they stopped the Syrian advance just miles from the Sea of Galilee. Reinforcements arrived, and within days, Israeli forces counterattacked, pushing Syrian troops back across the heights. In the Sinai, the initial Egyptian success slowed as Israeli armor regrouped. Fierce tank battles erupted in the desert. At the Battle of the Chinese Farm, one of the war's bloodiest clashes, Israeli forces fought through Egyptian defenses to reach the canal. Casualties on both sides were staggering. By mid-October, under the leadership of General Ariel Sharon, Israeli units found a gap between Egyptian armies. In a daring maneuver, Sharon's division crossed the canal westward, cutting into Egypt's rear. Suddenly, the hunters had become the hunted. Egyptian forces found themselves encircled, their supply lines severed. The world was watching closely. For the United States and the Soviet Union, the Yom Kippur War was more than a regional conflict. It was a proxy struggle in the Cold War. The Soviets airlifted weapons to Egypt and Syria. The Americans launched Operation Nickel Grass, flying in tanks, artillery, and ammunition to Israel. For days, giant C-141 transports landed in Tel Aviv, unloading supplies that kept the Israeli war effort alive. At the same time, the Arab states used oil as a weapon. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, led by Arab members, announced an embargo on nations supporting Israel. Oil prices quadrupled, triggering the 1973 energy crisis that shook the global economy. By October 22nd, Israeli forces were within striking distance of both Damascus and Cairo. The United Nations called for a ceasefire, but fighting continued. On October 25th, the war finally ended under heavy U.S. and Soviet pressure. The cost was staggering. Israel lost over 2,500 dead and thousands more wounded. Arab casualties were even higher, with Egypt and Syria each suffering tens of thousands. The war left landscapes littered with burnt-out tanks, twisted artillery, and the graves of thousands who had fought in the sands and hills of the Middle East. The aftermath reshaped the region. Israel had survived, but the myth of its invulnerability was gone. Its society was shaken, its government criticized for failing to anticipate the attack. In Egypt, Anwar Sadat claimed victory for shattering the image of Israeli dominance. He used the war as a springboard for diplomacy, eventually leading to the Camp David Accords and peace with Israel in 1979. For Syria, the war deepened hostility, ensuring that the Golan Heights would remain a flashpoint for decades. And for the world, the oil embargo underscored how deeply the Middle East could affect global stability. For the men who fought, the war was seared into memory. Israeli tank crews remembered the desperate days when they faced impossible odds. Egyptian veterans recalled the triumph of crossing the canal and the agony of encirclement. Syrian soldiers spoke of the massive tank battles on the Golan, fought under relentless fire. Across all sides, the Yom Kippur War left scars of loss, courage, and futility. 50 years later, it remains one of the defining conflicts of the Middle East, a war born of pride, fear, and the longing to rewrite history. It was a reminder that even holy days can be shattered by gunfire, that survival sometimes hangs by a single thread, and that peace can only be won when the cost of war becomes unbearable. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.